Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Jamie Sterner, and I'm a training technician at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center. Before introducing our guest speaker, I would like to acknowledge that NCTC is located in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, in the homeland of the Mesowomic Nation, and for that we give thanks, as it is on these lands that we are able to conduct the continuing education of service employees and our partners. Today, we are going to hear about subsistence hunting, fishing, and gathering in Alaska from Orville Lind. Orville was born and raised in the village of Chignik Lake on the Alaska Peninsula. He is the son of Fred and Annie Lind, and his grandparents are Dora and Fred Lindholm. He and his 6 brothers and 2 sisters. Orville has 4 sons, 1 daughter, and a wife of 41 years. His father founded Chignik Lake and was a longtime village chief until his passing in 1968. Later on, Orville was chosen by this village to become Chignik's youngest chief at the age of 18. Orville has an extensive background ranging from village chief to marine mammal tagger. He has more than 28 years of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Orville, I'll now hand it over to you.
Guyana, Jamie, thank you. And Shemai, everyone, hello. Again, name is Orville Lind. I was introduced into the Fish and Wildlife Service in 1991 as a refuge information technician, and for 4 years, and then promoted to a refuge ranger, which had several duties being a ranger. But I didn't have law enforcement, which was great because we didn't know about regulations back then in the villages that we lived around, because we just went out and harvested meat and salmon and whatever plants, berries, whenever we needed to feed our families, and also prepare for the winter months coming. And my first task was to educate people about the Fish and Wildlife Service and who they were and what is their mission. And of course, you've heard the mission is to protect and enhance all wildlife for the benefit of all American people. And kind of how we grew up, our grandfather, father, and uncles and aunts always told us to respect the land because it will take care of you if you do that, and also the waters. And so we grew up with that mentality, keeping the rivers clean, the creeks clean, the beaches and the lakes clean, our hunting cabin trails clean. And so when we did that, we were to be rewarded greatly, as Grandma used to say. Be respectful to the animals and the birds and the salmon, and they will feed you when the time comes. My native name is Gumhihak, which is eagle in Sugpiaq. Sugpiaq is an Alutiiq language, and it also means real people. Growing up, I was telling a friend of mine that, we really weren't told what to do. We were basically shown what to do with very little words. I remember one of the tasks for our uncles when father was away, either hunting or fishing, our uncles would be the ones to instruct us and show us what to do while he was away. So there was very few words, and there was a lot of nods and points, and that's how we learned. One of my first trips that I remember with my uncle was going up to the cabin, which was about an hour, almost an hour hike. And along the way, he motioned to me to be very quiet and just to follow behind him. And whenever we came upon tracks, he would show me the tracks of birds or animals. In this case, it was bear tracks and bird tracks. And just by observation, he would look and he would motion that this was a big bear or a big sow, and she had 2 cubs. And it was interesting that he would know that just from looking at the tracks. And so that was it was appealing to me that if I could learn as much as he knows, I would be doing really well. I would one day become a village chief. And we had this little place we went on top of. It was a little hill, but below the hill was a stream. And that stream during that fall trip that he took me on was full of red salmon, sockeye. When the sockeye go into fresh water, they turn from silver to red with green heads. And so it was a very beautiful day. I remember the sun coming up and warming the back of my head. And we saw these redfish in the streams, and there was a lot of redfish. And these are different species that we had. We had kings, and then we also had sockeyes. And so he would also motion to me to be very quiet and just look to see what was around us. And when the trip was over, he asked me, what did I see and what did I hear? So I saw a mother and cubs. Basically, the tracks we were tracking was her and her two cubs. And then we saw waterfowl, we saw mergansers, mallards, and we saw a couple other bears. So it was kind of just sitting and watching wildlife. And it was so peaceful. And I didn't know he was teaching me anything. I was just enjoying what I was seeing and hearing. And of course, it became more important to me that this is where our values are taught. Our values are brought to our attention by hiking, by going hunting and fishing, providing for our families. And along that line, we learn to have great respect for all the resources that are around us, and that, for example, the salmon, they feed us. They give us more than just food. They give us trinkets, for vertebrae, earrings, things that put on our gusbucks, which is an outer coat. And so we learn to value that resource, but we also learn the value of the bears. The bears they also provided food for us back then. My grandmother was born in Bear River on the Bristol Bay side, a place that had many bears, and so that was their diet, mostly bears, salmon, and berries. And it was really cool to look and listen and to see really how we become part of that environment, and how our traditional values really get so strong that we become part of that resource. It makes us who we really are. And again, I would also say that not only that we were taught the values growing up, but sometimes during that time we would also make mistakes. As a child, I remember my cousin got in big trouble because he left an empty can at the cabin and didn't take it back out. It was stuff like that, that we were taught early on, is to be respectful of things even like that. We didn't leave any trash behind. We took everything out. We had to keep everything clean, and our lives would be clean. That's just how we were taught. Along that, we became respectful and honor that we are part of this environment, and we depended on that environment to provide us with everything we needed. And then came subsistence. And so we just knew it as part of our life. And but it was given to us from an agency that were non-native, and so we didn't like the word subsistence, but we just have to go by it. We still understood that it is part of our life. Subsistence back then, we had numerous abundance of everything. from salmon, caribou, moose, bears, plants, berries. Gosh, it was a good time for me to grow up because we had no worries if where we were going to put food on the table, and then along the lines we also learned to share. If a family didn't go out and get their subsistence, we'd get it for them, and so we also learned that no matter where we were, even down the coast or up the coast, that we would, my uncles and my dad would bring food to those folks that weren't able to go out and get them. So we took care of our elders at a very young age. We learned to do that, and then even today, I still try to do that. Subsistence became a part of us, and our elders, taught us several stories about when you're successful in subsistence, you've actually come full circle. And it's a journey that we face every day from the time we wake up to the time we go back to bed. And that's a journey. And we never know about tomorrow's journey, but we learn to appreciate and value the journey we had done today, going on today. All that subsistence being successful, of course, elders taught us that it would make us stronger, healthier, and really being successful, it turned us to be able to become strong leaders. And one of the things that we also learned that when the salmon first started to come by up to the place where we lived, we let the salmon go by. We let the first salmon go by. And that was out of respect and giving thanks that they would return to us. And again, we look forward for that resource to feed our families and our villages. We respected the first caribou that came through, that migrated through. We didn't take the first caribou that came through. We let the migratory birds, the lead bird, go by, the first flocks go by. And we were taught that those types of leaders are just like our village chief. We have a lot of respect and honor for them, and we let them do what they're doing, leading their flocks or herds, or as a chief would lead these people. That was very, very strong values for us. Another resource we had a lot of respect for was the birds, migratory birds during the fall and spring. And I remember my grandmother was laughing at me because I was telling her the story about going after a bird, and because his wing was hurt. I remember it was a mallard on the water, and she laughed and said she was just trying to distract you to think that she was hurt, but in the meantime she was leading you away from her children. And I never thought of that, and so that's great. That's a great way to being taught that birds are so smart, but they also provided us with food, us with eggs. And so, again, the value was there to have much respect for that resource. Later on, I learned that we also learned some dances from the birds. Some of the cultures you see in Alaska will dance like a crane or birds that we have in Alaska. And camel, where did that come from? The birds. Ptarmigan, a very good example that, in the wintertime they turn white. And in the fall time they get back to their colors, browns and oranges. And so it was really cool. Then it came to me that I know now why we have white gusbucks in the fall time. In the winter time is to become like an environment where we could actually sit and the resource would come to us. We believe in a lot of living things that have spirits, and it's an honor for that spirit. If it was a caribou to come to us and we could harvest, so we could feed our families and in the other villages, that was very important. I remember when I was 12, I harvested my first caribou, and I was actually, I remember, whoa, I didn't get any of that. I had to give it all away to the elders in the village. and that's just the way we were taught. And so we learn as we're growing up to be givers because we were given the resource. We now give it to those in need. I remember also the story of my grandmother on the beach. I wanted to go fishing with my father, but he didn't take me. I was about 7 years old, and so I was angry sitting on the beach. But there was salmon jumping everywhere. And my grandmother came down, and she says, one day you'll get big and strong enough, then your dad will take you fishing. And so I asked, why are all these fish jumping? Why are they here? She says, well, I think they're happy because they've come back home. I remember my children, when they come home, they're always so happy. She had this stick in her hand. She began to draw a river on the sand, and she says, the salmon come from the river, like up at the lake. And they take this journey, and she was drawing this line on the sand. And sometimes they'll face trouble. They'll face trying times, and she'll make a little squiggle there, and she continued her line on the sand and says, but you'll mature and you'll learn from that mistake, and then you go along further, and then you start growing up, you become more smarter, but you'll run into trouble again. And then she'd do another squiggle, and she kind of made a circle. You'll live out in the ocean there, just like you'll grow up and you'll get smarter and stronger, and then it's time for you to come home. If there's a right time, you will know. When you come home, you'll still face trouble here and there, and as you go back to the river where you were born, then you come full circle, and then it's full of joy. And that's why the fish are jumping, she would say. And anyway, it's very important that we come full circle in our culture. That way we're healthier, we're stronger, we're smarter. And there are times where our journey doesn't come full circle, but also it's a time of learning that we take. And I don't know about you folks, but if I make a bad mistake, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to make that mistake again. And I think that's a good lesson learned. Today's subsistence is a little different from when I was growing up, because I think there's a lot of factors out there now, and one of them is climate change. There are still human impacts, and it's affecting our subsistence resources. As a native liaison for the Office of Subsistence Management, in my job, I'm involved with 229 federal recognized tribes in Alaska, and 12 regional corporations, and up to 200 plus or so village corporations. So I'm in contact with a lot of native leaders and corporation leaders, and it's all the same story. They're worried about their subsistence because some folks aren't getting their subsistence foods on the table. And this is due to migration changes, caribou migration changes. Moose populations are also decreasing, and they're moving around. I had a friend not too long ago tell me that they've seen caribou where they've never seen caribou before, and so that means they've changed their migration pattern. Whether it's due to human impacts or climate change, I know some biologists will say, they've moved into new feeding grounds because they feed on certain lichens and plants. And but however, it's the same story. Seems like not only in Alaska but all over our country. And the only, I guess, summary that I can share is that people are making changes. They're making changes to focus on other resources, and people are really making efforts to feed those families who don't have subsistence foods. Our cultures in Alaska are very resilient people who love to share, who love to give, and I think that's what makes us unique in this world of subsistence, is that we help each other out when we can and where we can. I remember since I've moved to a non-subsistence region, I gave up my subsistence life when I moved here to the big city. And fortunately, I have family and friends who send me subsistence foods all the time. And it does come true what Grandma said: when you learn to give when you're young, you will receive when you get old. So her words have come true. Working as a Native liaison for the tribes, I'm so sometimes, I guess the word would be just, I'm at awe in hearing what things are going on. My own village of Chignik, no fish are returning back there, and there are 5 other villages around there that depend on the salmon to come in, and yet their return is very weak. And when you think about salmon declining, you have to look at the big picture also, and that's as I learned in high school, the web of life. When a certain resource is gone, it affects other resources. As for salmon, I've gotten pictures from back home of very skinny bears, where I remember they used to be big and healthy. Eagles are also not in abundance back there anymore. And of course, I love eagles. I was named after them. But it's not only, it affects everything. The food chain is disrupted, and so are the lives of those who depend on it. But I do believe there is still hope, because I've known that there are some villages really educating their youth about the value of the resource and the value of salmon. And I think that our children are learning a lot through our culture camps, like they used to be. There was a time where culture camps deceased. They just weren't around anymore. Whether it was due to jobs, people moving from the village, gosh, the pandemic, it separated a lot from us, separated from our own families, our neighbors, and so we learn to deal with it in our own ways. And I think there's always something good that comes out of something bad. And certainly got to learn how my laptop a lot better. It was great to see family and friends on screen, and so I learned a few things, and that's good. I'm not a computer friendly kind of person, but I make do, and I certainly have a lot of friends that teach me a lot. There was one more thing I'd like to share. The agency I work for has done so much, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. I believe that the outreach efforts that we do on educating our people why we do what we do as an agency, and we really are trying to monitor Alaska's resource. We're trying to figure out and find balance with subsistence users, but not only those, but all the sport users and the commercial users today. And there's some battles out there, but I believe that by educating everybody at the table, first of all, inviting everybody to the table and educating them and hear the different perspectives, one thing I found out for sure is that we're never going to please everybody, but I tell you what, there are phenomenal things that have been accomplished by sitting at the table. And the native way is to have a cup of coffee, have some tea, That's why in every village you have a gathering place. And that's where we've become successful, I believe. And I think we're totally getting better at communication. But again, there's still room to improve. One of the success stories, I think, is the Refuge Information Technician program. Oh my gosh, being a Refuge Information Technician for 4 years was a blessing to me. Really understanding the Fish and Wildlife Service and how they communicate was a really strong point in my career when I realized that there's different types of lands out there. We all thought it was given to us, and we could go anywhere to harvest anything we wanted anytime we needed it. But there are different lands out there: BLM, BIA, Forest Service, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, refuge lands, and we have to learn about those and again communicate with those people that are really landowners in order for us to figure out and create regulations that affect the tribes in our state. And I think we've gotten better at it. But however, again, we have lots of room to improve. And the other success story, I think, is also the Fish and Wildlife Service has helped us tremendously. Is in the beginning when I became a refuge information technician, we had news of the declining species of emperor geese back home, and it was a tough job trying to educate my people that you shouldn't take emperor geese anymore because of the declining populations. And we learned real quick how to disseminate information and make it in a friendly way that people would honor and also cooperate. Because now, even though they have other resources they can depend on, I know most folks that I know, it says, you know what, I'm doing this because I would love for my children to harvest that when they grow up. There was a value that was there, in an effort to teach traditional values. They have to know what that bird provides. Again, the emperor geese was very valuable to us because it was a geese that always came around, not only in the springtime, but they would winter there over the winter, and so they kind of provided for us all year round. And there was a lot of respect for that. I love my down feather blanket I used to have, and my grandmother used to have several pillows. So again, there was a lot of respect for that. Emperors were so low that for several years we continued to teach about the emperor geese and how valuable that resource was, and that it was declining so rapidly. They were really concerned, but it wasn't only in the Alaska Peninsula, but it was throughout Alaska's coast. Eventually, we learned that also emperors came from Russia, and so they weren't just in Alaska. However, we did have a population that just spent their winters in Alaska. And one of the things that I remember, my son, his first goose was an emperor goose, and it was just beginning at I believe in 1990, and I didn't join the service till 91. We were hearing stories of the emperor geese and its decline. But however, in some places back home, we still had a great number of emperors that would come to the beaches while they were moving around. Another success story, I think, is the calendar program with the Fish and Wildlife Service. It was through the RIT program that, along with the Fish and Wildlife Service, that we decided that an educational tool would be having students become aware of the issue of declining geese. And so why not have a contest? And in the waterfowl program, the emperor geese to increase the information for that, we did a contest, a calendar, calendar it was called, and it was so much fun. You know, it's not rocket science, but if you're having fun doing what you're doing, you're going to remember. You're going to remember it a lot. You never forget the fun times, especially if you learn something along the way. It's just good. It really is. And I think education, and no matter what culture you're in, come back to the table and we learn from each other. It's a win-win situation. It is. We learn from each other. It's great. I think we need to teach our youth the same thing. There's a lot of misinterpretations out there, and sometimes we hurt and offend others, but if we sit at the same table and converse with each other, we're going to have a chance. With that, I'm going to close, and I would like to entertain any questions you have for me. Guyanasana, thank you very much.
At this time, we'll go into questions and answers. If you have questions for Orville, please enter them into the chat. All right, first question. We have eagles all over the state of Alaska. What is impacting the eagle populations in Alaska? Is it climate change or habitat loss?
Great question. I believe a lot of it has to do with climate change. Many cultures have a lot of respect for the eagles because they represent a lot of things. Back, at least from my region, the reason the eagles are leaving is because of lack of food. As you know, eagles love fish, different sizes, even as big as they are. And with the climate change, I heard a biologist say that with the heating of the surface of the ocean, a lot of the food goes deeper to keep the cooler temperature. And therefore, that was one of the reasons we had a huge seabird die-off, is because they basically starved, not having enough food. And of course, you know that eagles also love seabirds as part of their diet. And if the food's not there, you know, it's just like us. If we have a favorite restaurant and it goes down, we just move to a different restaurant. And it kind of is what the eagles are doing. I think they're moving wherever they can find a good food source.
Thank you for that. And I think that ties next into our next question. What is a hot topic in subsistence in Alaska, and what is being done about it?
Oh gosh, there are several hot topics, but I have to focus. If I were to focus on one, I think it's the lack of subsistence food on subsistence families' tables. And again, we're in very trying times, especially during the pandemic, where you know, folks just didn't visit a lot of people up the river or down the river, and so therefore each families were mostly getting their own subsistence food and trying their best to survive from the virus by staying home. And nowadays, like I said, climate change has done a lot of changes. For example, the salmon streams, the quantity of water is not there anymore because a lot of it is just declining. We have rivers and lakes back home that have really dried up. And where we used to have salmon when I was a child, there's there's no water there anymore. So I think climate change is changing a lot of stuff. Also, the other thing is that we can't leave out human impacts. I think since a resource has many, many users, again, we have programs like the Federal Subsistence Program that have to really dive in deep to, first of all, we provide subsistence on federal public lands and waters. Therefore, that's our focus. And we have other agencies, other land ownerships too, like Park Service and BIA and BLM. We have to focus on those also. So I think, again, like I said before, is that there are a lot of issues out there. And I think one way, one of the tools that we have is bringing everybody to the table. And that way we learn about harvest levels, we learn about migration patterns, we learn about commercial users, sport users, and kind of get a big picture on really where can we find a close balance to make folks happy. A lot of times it's not a good turnout, it's not a good answer, but it's the best answer.
So we've spent a lot of the last part of the hour talking about subsistence. How does subsistence compare to the cost of groceries in Alaska?
Oh gosh, well, that is a very good question. And I know from experience and hearing from some tribal leaders that some of their stores have closed down. They no longer have the staples of salt and pepper and sugar and milk, rice, those important staples. So they're having to order from further distances, which cost more. And then with the price of fuel rising so high that they can't go further to harvest their, for example, caribou. The caribou normal migration change, or the normal migration would have been just north of the village, but now they have to go 3 times the distance because the migration pattern has changed. And so there's a lot of effects out there for rural Alaskans for their subsistence. Again, they're trying very hard. Again, I have to say, Alaskans are very resilient. They know how to harvest. They know where the animals are and the birds are, and they take that extra step, whatever it takes, to put subsistence foods on the table. But it's not only their families, but they also are helping folks who aren't able to go out and get their subsistence foods. So again, we have that connectivity out there of giving and sharing our subsistence foods out there. Regardless of the high cost, it's still, subsistence givers are still giving.
Are there any worries about chronic wasting disease? If so, do you see how TEK would help manage this disease?
Yeah, I think there's a level of concern out there because of I heard a biologist say that the warmer temperatures, the more diseases that are going to happen to the animals and the birds, even the salmon. I've seen pictures of growth on salmon that I've never seen before because of climate change. And I also heard an elder speak about those things happening. When she was young, she heard a story that these things are going to happen, and so we must prepare for that. And again, we have no control over that type of deal, but talking to elders, they survived it. And so that's how important is we need to take some time and listen to how they survived. How did they keep that from affecting their families and their villages? And so, yes, TEK, traditional ethical knowledge, is just super important. I think even for the new biologists today, is to kind of get a big picture how this happened and how they survived for future references. Great question.
Really was, and thank you for your response. Can you speak to your role with the service and how your village's perspective on your role and why you decided to work for the service?
Well, I'll have to go back to the last question. When I decided to work for the service, I was actually a training bear guide, big game guide, and because they made a lot of money, and I wanted to make a lot of money, and so I guided for about 5.5 years. But during the last three years I was guiding, I saw a lot of wanton waste, and it bothered me a great deal because we just grew up without wasting any food, and to see a lot of poaching going on, a lot of wasteful food that was being wasted, I decided, well, I'm going to become a refuge ranger, and I'm going to catch all these crooks in Alaska. That was my goal. Of course, when I became a refuge ranger, I had 3 weeks to decide whether I needed to go to law enforcement school. And it was my brother saying, you know, Orville, becoming law enforcement, you have to deal with your own people. Because remember, we go out and get what we need when we need it. And if I go out and get a caribou off the season, are you going to arrest me? So that question just pierced my heart. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't see myself arresting my own people. So I refused law enforcement and chose to educate instead. And I think that was the right decision. Kept my family honest in educating regulations and the changes and, land status. Maps was the greatest thing that ever came to the villages, because you could see whose land was whose, where the federal lands were, where the native corporation lands were, native allotments. People began to learn that, okay, I can go harvest caribou over here when it opens up and whatnot. So things got really well. People were learning a lot. Let's see. The other one was as the role continues to be educating the people about the Fish and Wildlife Service, and during this time as a Native liaison for Subsistence, I love what I do because I had the same questions that people have today, and I'm very fortunate to work with a very, very educated staff of people who I feel I'm very privileged to be amongst, because we're dealing with regulations, creating regulation, making recommendations to help those subsistence users out there. And going back to my village, where fear is real. If the salmon doesn't come again, I don't know how they're going to pay for winter fuel, winter groceries. The cost is too high, and our resources are not there anymore. So I feel that pain and that worry, and it's a big concern.
Would you say that there are shared goals between Fish and Wildlife Service and working with the local villages?
Oh, absolutely. Once they understand that, again, back to the mission, this agency is very helpful in finding ways to continue subsistence. And one of the ways is the cultural education permit program. In 2018, when the salmon didn't return to Chignik, people didn't know what was happening to the salmon, but they just wanted to harvest salmon. And one of the ways was through an educational, cultural educational permit, where the school people applied, and they were going to educate their children on how to prepare salmon, and we provided that permit for them, and it's gotten some attention, and I believe that they will be doing that again for this summer.
Okay. The next question. Why was the word subsistence not preferred originally? Would there be a better word to use?
Well, a lot of us are sticking to a way of life. It's a native way of knowing. That's my preference. Um, Although, there are so many people now that have been educated about subsistence, about the word, that we'll let them have it this time. We still know what we have to do. We still know what the value is of our way of knowing. And so subsistence is just a word um, to some people, but it's now, I think, earning value in the trying times that the subsistence users are trying to put food on their table.
Lost my spot here. Do you see a healthy future for subsistence way of life in Alaska?
Well, I think there are going to be times where subsistence harvest is good. As of last week, I understand that in some parts of Alaska, the salmon have showed up. In parts of Alaska, the waterfowl have showed up in abundance. And so there's always hope because going back to the story with my uncle taking me out on that hike, um, we learn when to harvest the resource because the resource tells us when it's time. I remember talking to a fisheries biologist who's a very good friend of mine who now lives in, I believe, in Washington, said that he learned so much from the people there when he was doing his studies uh, from smolt to adult salmon for several years. And I remember him saying that, it was the elders that taught him that, as a biologist, we kind of control when to open the season for salmon. But an elder taught me when to go out and harvest the salmon when it was the right time to do so. And so he saw a different world. And it was only when these two worlds come together did they learn from each other and really start to see the value in how important his job was and how important the elders' observation skills were. And so with that, we get the TEK, and then we have the scientists sort of working closer to us and with us for this resource, which is really important.
I've recently learned about catch and release being a common practice when fishing in certain areas in the United States. What do Alaska Natives think about practice like catching fish to release?
Well, I'll tell you my first experience is when in '95 I moved to king salmon from my village of Meshik, and I brought my subsistence skills with me and just wanted to go out and harvest some fish, some redfish. And as my cousin took me out, um, I actually got one on my line and I was pulling it in. And he says, "You've got to release that one." And I said, "What? You have to release that fish." "I've never released a salmon in my life. I'm keeping it. I'm taking it home. That's my food." He says, "Well, I hope you don't get caught because it's against the law here in the river." And it was within the Park Service. And I said, "Man, this is crazy. I better start looking into these laws so I don't get arrested and I'm on the news as a Fish and Wildlife Service employee. That would be pretty embarrassing." And then I learned also that, when my grandmother observed fishery biologists taking the fish from the weir and putting tags on them and letting them go again, she did not like it one bit. She said, "Why are they doing that to that fish? Let them fish go where they want to go. Why are they tagging them? She didn't understand why they were doing what they were doing. And so the word got out as they were just playing with our resource, with our food. That's not respecting the resource. If you play with it, if you handle it like that, there's no respect to that. They should stop doing that. Don't bother the resource. Let them go and come, because that's what we rely on. That's what we depend on. And that's who and what we respect and we value so much. So a lot of the I guess, familiar was with how they put transmitters in salmon and tags on salmon. People didn't like that. I actually had a person say, "How about if I stuck a tag on you? I don't think you'd like that, would you?" I said, "No, I wouldn't." But yeah, so with understanding why they were doing what they were doing, I think people are a little better at it. Why we have weirs, so we can keep that resource healthy and strong. However, I know in my region there's probably a lot of negativity going on of the management decisions that have been made in the past that has affected the outcome of the returning salmon. And again, I've seen this agency restore salmon streams. For example, out further in the chain, there was a stream that lacked silver salmon, and there was a program working with ADF&G to restore that by raising smolt and releasing the smolt in that salmon that stream, and they came back. So there's a lot of success stories that tell us that this agency really is good for us, and we just need to work with them and try to understand why and what they're doing.
Okay, another question we have is, do you think that trophy hunting has impacted the disease resistance ability of subsistence animals?
Well, I can tell you what I've experienced. Well, when I was a training guide on Alaska Peninsula. So if you had a map of the Alaska Peninsula, here's a state in the Alaska Peninsula goes out like that. And again, we're on the Pacific side of the coast. And as a guide, I know there were 7 lodges in every valley that led to the north side of the peninsula. So when we're looking at the Pacific coast of the Alaska Peninsula, and then looking north, in every valley that went through there was a lodge, a hunting lodge. And if you know the history of the Alaska Northern Peninsula caribou herd, diminished back in the early 90s. And I was part of the group, the Regional Advisory Council, that really developed and created some regulations that helped folks still continue to harvest caribou until the last, where we went from a tier program to a closure, a full closure, so no one could harvest caribou. And think about it. I remember an elderly man says, "This is crazy. How could you stop us from hunting caribou? That's what we rely on. That's our foods." And it was a tough deal. But again, as resilient as Alaskans are, we focus more on moose and more waterfowl, more salmon at the time. And with the cooperation, again, after we brought everybody to the table, everybody, including commercial and sport users, ADF&G, the state, we managed to keep it closed for several years. And a few years ago, it was open again because the caribou herd was healthy. And so again, cooperation shows that it's a win-win situation when you cooperate in those trying times. And we continue to do that. Whenever you're dealing with wildlife, it's never an easy fix. It does take some time, and definitely does take some patience.
So can you tell us about the first time, or at least your family's reaction, the first time they saw you in a service uniform?
That's one of my favorite stories. So I joined the service in 1991, and I didn't wear the uniform till latter part of '92, when my supervisor says, "Well, you're working for us now, so now you got to wear a uniform." And I'm thinking, "Oh boy, okay." I got away with it for the first year, and so now the boss is telling me to wear the uniform. Without anybody else knowing that I was wearing a uniform, I traveled to my village where I was born and raised, Chignik Lake, and to do some education in the school. And the education was, again, on emperor geese. And I had my uniform on and my hat. And as I got off the airplane, my uncle kind of second looked at me twice and says, "Oh boy, now we're all in trouble." Kind of joked like that. And then he said, "Get on the bike." And he drove me from the airport, which was at the head of the north side of the village, all the way to the south end where he had his house. So we drove through the village to several houses on the trail back to his house. And when we got there, I remember my auntie saying, "The phone is ringing, so answer it." And so he would answer the phone and says, "Yep, you better get down here. He wants to talk to you." And then the phone would ring again and says, "Yeah, he needs to talk to you. You better come down." And so I had about 5 people, friends of mine, of course, relatives. When they walked through the door, they would see my face and say, "What the heck, Orville? Oh my gosh." Anyway, they thought I was a wildlife trooper, and someone had gotten in trouble, and I was down there to take them away. And so it wasn't a good experience. But it took 5-6 years for people to get comfortable me wearing the uniform. And the key thing was that once I told them about the mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service, what their mission was basically the same direction that Grandpa gave to me, Dad gave to me, my uncles, talked about taking care of the land and the waters, and it'll take care of you, and having a lot of respect for the resource. Gosh, once I made that connection, people were saying, "Right on. You can wear your uniform. Come and have coffee. Come and have tea." We had a running joke, actually, an RIT program after a few years that had been initiated in the early '80s. And as I said, '91 is when I was hired. So about '94, '95, if you saw a refuge information technician that had put on some weight, you were doing a great job, because they were inviting you to their home, feeding you really good. And so it was sort of a joke. Luckily, I didn't get too heavy.
Luckily.
Yeah. So yeah,
Thank you, Orville, for sharing.
The uniform, and it's good now. At one point, my Auntie Mary says, "How come you're not in uniform?" And I said, "Oh, well, I decided not to wear it." So people got really comfortable with it, and they now understand Fish and Wildlife Service better. And however, we still have young folks growing up, and so we still need to have. I always say it like this: saturate and educate our people, but we also have to do the same thing to the government. We have to saturate and educate them too.
Thank you so much, Orville, for sharing your knowledge with us today. We truly appreciate your time. As a reminder, NCTC will continue hosting the Tribal Broadcast Series on the third Thursday of each month, with the exception of July. Please plan to join us for our next broadcast titled Federal Native American Lands Trust on Thursday, August 19th at 3 p.m. ET. Also, each broadcast is recorded and available on NCTC's website. Thank you for joining us today.
Guyana, thank you very much.